All grief is the same. It's just one grief. Every different thing we grieve is a pathway to that one grief, an access point. This truth is shared by many people, but I learned it from Sobonfu and Malidoma Somé, two siblings from a village in Burkina Faso who were sent by their elders to share how to grieve with the Western world because we've forgotten. Understanding that all grief is one changes life. Growing up all through my life, I've watched many men wrestle with grief. I've watched men at their wives' funerals wrestle with grief. Men fight harder than I've ever seen anyone fight to hold back tears over the literal graves of their children. I've watched men minimize grief, saying, it was only a cat. It was only a friend. I didn't know them that well. We weren't that close. It was only a dog. All you other men, grief is not our enemy. Grief is not our opponent. We don't have to wrestle or fight grief, and the degree to which we do is the degree to which we separate ourselves from our own humanity. We said goodbye to our dog Merlin on Saturday. On Friday night, as my wife and I lay in bed sobbing next to him, I felt a flash of guilt. And it came up because the feeling of deep grief that this was the last night I would share with that dog felt familiar to 8 years ago when my father passed, and I knew it was the last night I would have a father in this world. Beyond Gary Snyder's wise statement, comparisons are odious, it was Sobonfu Somé's truth that all grief is one that helped me set that flash of guilt down. Both my father and my dog were helping open pathways for me to my own emotions. It's like the ocean. Wherever you are in the world, if you touch the ocean, you're touching the same ocean, regardless of what lines and names humans put on maps and charts. But your experience of that ocean is unique to that time and place. But it's the same ocean. If you ask Martin Prechtel, the beautiful, crazy old medicine man who wrote The Smell of Rain on Dust, Grief and Praise, he'd say that it's not even a metaphor, that the ocean holds all the world's grief together, catches the salt of all our tears. My instinct, from my entire upbringing, is to hold my grief down, close and personal, to wrestle it, to fight it down, to tuck it away. This is what I watched my father do, and every man I knew as a child. I watched men go through horrible things and write it off, get right back to work. If they said anything, it was often global condemnations like, yeah, life's hard. This is hardwired into me. And over the last months, I've been working to be really present with how much Merlin's passing is impacting me. And that doesn't change my hardwired subconscious instinct to contain and conceal my grief when it comes up. My wife can read me like a book, and often while we're driving or moving around the house, she'll just reach over and take my hand or put a hand on my back. She does things like that all the time anyway, but this is qualitatively different. She also does that thing she does all the time, but the difference is palpable. She's making contact as an explicit invitation to share our grief, to be present with my emotions. My visceral instinct every time is to act like nothing's wrong, to smile at her, to tuck it away. And it takes a conscious choice every time to meet her, which requires facing my grief, welcoming it, not wrestling or fighting it. It's very hard. Every time, it's very hard to make that choice. There's a few things that help, though. One is from Martin Prechtel. He outlines very clearly how our grief is our praise. It is our gratitude. The two are not separate. My grief at Merlin's passing is the same as my gratitude for sharing his life, the praise and joy I have for him. Every wonderful time I've had with him, lesson I've learned from him, is balanced in equal part by the grief I feel at his passing. Our grief is our gratitude. When we deny one, we deny the other. For me to repress or minimize or deny my grief at this time would be me saying that Merlin didn't matter that much to me. And he fucking did. He mattered more than I'll ever have words to express. I loved him, so I grieve him. It's the same. Another reason I choose to face my grief when my wife reaches for me that way is because I understand the concept of gaslighting. My wife can tell I'm hurting. If they were to reach out for me when they know I'm in pain, and I were to say, no, everything's fine, that would be me gaslighting my spouse. I'd be telling them that they're wrong, when they're absolutely not. They're savvy enough to immediately see that if I did that, I would be denying my own emotion, which I probably still do sometimes, but I don't want to lie to my spouse, and I don't want to gaslight them, even if they can see that that's what's happening. So, as part of my relational agreements, and in honor of my spouse, I face my emotions the best I can. Another reason I lean into grief is because all grief is one. My childhood was rough. And nothing enraged and provoked my father like grief, no matter the reason. In retrospect, it was obviously because he was full of unprocessed grief, so any grief was existentially terrifying to him. But I have deep, old memories of that terrifying man yelling, "Oh, here come the waterworks," and coming at my sisters or my mother or me or whoever was daring to express grief in his presence. So there's a lot that I have to grieve that I've never expressed because grief was not only unwelcome but dangerous in my home. So the knowledge that all grief is one opens me up. Anything that helps me cry today, I love. Whether it's that scene in Shrek where Fiona thinks that he doesn't love her, or my dog passing on, I lean into it. Because it helps a few more of those tears I've been repressing my whole life, that my father repressed in himself and in me, come forward. And because all grief is one, it's powerfully contagious. So Merlin's passing helps open other people he never met. He calls forth their tears. And who would I be to cut off his magic from doing that work in the world? Who would I be to sever that connection that he's making between my wife and I, between her and her grief, that opens up more when I lean into mine, between you and your grief, as you hear about a dog and a man you never met? I won't stand in the way of any of those connections or pathways of healing by hiding this or minimizing it or denying it. So leading up to saying goodbye on Saturday, I grieved a lot. I said everything I could think of to say to him. He couldn't stand it all by the end, so I stabilized him as he put his paws in the water of a stream and drank deep one last time. The care that we took and the presence we practiced with our grief let us welcome his death. I feel like if I were death, I'd be pretty insulted by Western culture these days, always being called a thief or shunned or shamed or ignored. We courted and welcomed death. We thanked them for their grace and power and beauty as they came and took my brother away from his well-worn and well-loved body. He was tired and done, and I am so grateful for death, for his death. And that gratitude is my grief as well. It's the same. But I can only see that because I welcome the grief. If I minimized or denied or shunned my grief, I would never be able to see the gratitude that's interwoven with it. Let me show you something. We thought about different ways to send Merlin off. We thought about burying him or having him cremated or water cremation, but after a lot of prayers, it felt right to send him off with a traditional pyre. I'd never done this before, and I had a fear approaching it. My fear was of seeing his remains in the fire. I pictured it as horrible, and I didn't want to see it. Even as we stacked a cord of cured oak and made a bed of hemlock boughs to rest him on, as we laid his wrapped body there covered in tears and cedar and prayers and flowers, I was afraid. There were many wonderful people at that ceremony, and we invited people to bring their grief as well, because all grief is one. But at one point, it was just my spouse and I tending it for a while. Other folks were down at the campsite tending the food in the cook fire. And as we stood there, we did see his body, but it was not at all how I expected. The flames from a cord of cured oak are very hot, flowing blue and white ringed by orange. The edges of this pyre had collapsed, so it was a small mountain of burning wood with flames and thick smoke and sparks flying up to the stars. Can you picture it? And in this moment, and I describe this with no poetic license at all, this is what happened. We saw his form, pure black, a silhouette in the heart of these flames, at the very peak of this mountain of fire. His body, his back was arched, and his head was tipped back up to the stars, both howling and leaping in a way that he howled or leapt in a long time. The only part of him that was not pure black was his eyes, which were glowing red coals, as he appeared to joyfully leap and howl up that mountain of flames into the night sky. My wife and I stood there and howled as he taught us to, as he rode those flames. The thing that I feared most in this ceremony for my brother was the thing I needed most. It was not at all what my fear imagined. It was so much more powerful than anything I could have dreamt. That image of him, eyes aflame and leaping up and away with a joyful howl, is one that I will carry the rest of my life. The beauty in it was a world-shaking. The part of my fear that was right was the awareness of its power. It was an awesome, terrible power. But it wasn't something to shy away from or be afraid of. It was something I needed more than I could ever know. There's no one right way to tend a body. Burial or modern cremation are beautiful, but we would have been wrong to make that choice based on fear. It would have led us to miss the incredible gift that he was leaving us with. In facing our grief and leaning into an old practice of our ancestors, Merlin gave us an awesome image that feels like something out of a fairy tale. One of the lessons is that the world is what we make it. If we make it a small thing, sterile and modern and staid, restricted by our fear, then we never get the awesome beauty that waits on the other side of our grief and our fear. Tending that fire down to ash took about 24 hours. As we tended the fire and shared stories and songs and food and laughter and howls, we watched the moon rise and set, and then we watched the sun rise and set, wrapped in wool and grief and our other dogs. I don't talk much about my spirituality on here because it's hard to understand and easy to misunderstand, but at that fire, we asked Merlin to carry whatever he felt called across that veil with him. Whatever wounds in us, our relationship, or the world that he could see that he wanted to help us move, we told him we trusted him and opened ourselves to him carrying those across. I'm a scientist. I know that this may well just be us speaking to ourselves, and it's hard to describe how much that doesn't matter to me. Also, I'm enough of a scientist to know how much we don't know, and every indigenous culture in the world, whose track records are far better than Western science, has ancestral practices, so I skip the common hubris of pseudoscientific presumption that we know everything there is to know, and embrace the practices of my healthy ancestors as best I can. I honor cycles and nature and my ancestors. When we asked this of Merlin and opened ourselves to it, standing in front of his pyre, I wept like a little child. I felt like a little boy, just weeping and choking on my tears. I said to my wife as we clung to each other there, I feel like a little child, and I felt how terrifyingly uncomfortable that was. In my grief, I saw how unsafe that little child I had been was, and wept for that, wept his tears, wept that little boy's tears. And it felt like those old tears were being pulled up out of me. I couldn't breathe. That was Merlin answering my prayers, carrying some old wounds over, helping me heal. And it took facing my grief to get there. It took practicing facing my grief for many years now. And for the last few months in particular, it took me practicing every time my wife took my hand, recognizing that I was sad, leaning into that. It's like lifting weights. You got to build up to the heavier work. Every now and then, some guy who watches Too Much Fresh and Fit comes in my comments and says, you sound smart, but how can I trust someone who's overweight? It always makes me laugh a little. I can grieve in a way that makes me healthier. They're not mutually exclusive. My point is just that we're using different metrics for fitness. By my lights, I'm more fit now than I've ever been in my life. I went to sleep last night sobbing with my spouse, next to the empty spot where our dog used to sleep. We woke up and sobbed together again. My marriage feels strong and connective through the passing of a beloved family member. Our shared grief is bringing us closer, and we are healthier on the other side of Merlin's ceremony. That takes hard-earned fitness and skill from both of us. Nothing is repressed, nothing is denied. After tending that fire, we were covered in our dog's ash and the salt of our tears and sweat. Burned and dirty in the formal wear we'd honored him with, we came home and showered together, washing each other with love and salt. And then we held each other and sobbed again. That is what emotional presence looks like in grief. Funerals and burials in my community often involve song. Whenever it's appropriate, I will offer a song, usually a sad country song, sung alone and a cappella. Almost always, I'm the only man who does so. It's always almost entirely women who sing. Often I'm the only man who cries at all. And every time, other men come up and thank me, struggling to find the words for what it meant to them that I sang. Men who were the departed's close family are coming up and saying, thank you. I nod and shake their hand because that's the only language they have. But there's a part of me that wants to shake them because I can feel their grief. I can feel them wrestling with it like an enemy and losing because it's stronger than them. Remember how all grief is one? It's stronger than you. You won't win that fight. All you'll do is drive it into anger and dissociation and addiction. Everyone around you will lose when you wrestle with grief. All you can do is be a conduit. Let it move through you. You men want to know what strength and courage looks like today? It looks like facing your grief and letting it move, sharing it with those close to you and your community. So I want to shake those men and say, where are your tears? Where are your songs? It doesn't matter if your voice breaks, man. That's the point here. How dare you run from your grief here today at your nephew's grave? How dare you role model that for his little brother, for all the little brothers? Where are you, man? Where are you, men? In order to heal us and the world, we need to break. Did you think you could do that in silence? Totally in private and safety? With words like, it was just a dog, it was just my son, it was just a wounded lineage that's burning the world and everything we love? Our fear feeds those wounds and makes more of that unprocessed grief. My father ran from his work, and in doing so, he amplified his wounds and passed them on. Will we do the same? Or will we throw our head back like Merlin teaches and howl our grief to the stars so we can find the gratitude and healing on the other side? I feel the grief calling the men, and I'm asking you to come. It's beautiful here. I feel more whole. I feel a weave of gratitude and grief that is life and healing. I feel a beauty that reminds me of being a boy. I miss my father, and I'm looking forward to seeing my wife when she gets home. I greet my dogs and my spouse and my friends with care and love. And I can feel the beauty in the world right now. I can feel how another world is possible.